In the depths of an abandoned villa, a trembling figure cowered in the shadows, clutching a vial of poison like a lifeline. His name was Sporus, a young man with the eyes of a dead woman, and he was about to make the most desperate decision of his life, to end it all before Nero's madness consumed him completely. It was the year 65 A.D., and the Emperor of Rome, Nero, was more than a ruler. He was a broken man, shattered by the loss of his beloved wife, Poppea Sabina. The love that once held the empire together had turned into an obsession so intense, so toxic, that it consumed Nero's very soul. His grief was not of the ordinary kind. It was the grief of a man who believed he could bend the world to his will, yet found himself powerless in the face of death. When Poppea died, Nero did not simply mourn. He fractured. In the aftermath, he found solace in nothing, except the strange thought that perhaps, just perhaps, if he could find someone who resembled her, he could undo the irreparable wound she left behind. Sporus was just a boy when Nero found him, a mere servant, nothing more than a face in the crowd. But to Nero, Sporus was everything, a reflection of the woman he had loved so intensely that he could no longer see her death as anything other than a violation of nature itself. It wasn't enough for Nero to mourn Poppea's loss. No, he had to resurrect her. The emperor of the most powerful empire on earth would not accept the finality of death. Instead, he sought to defy it, to resurrect his lost love, not through magic, not through prayer, but by turning a boy into a woman. Sporus would become his dead wife, surgically remade to fulfill the impossible dream of a broken man. The emperor's grief knew no limits. It wasn't enough to mourn her. Nero needed her to remain with him, preserved like an artifact of a love that had consumed him. And so, Poppea was embalmed, draped in robes, and placed in a crystal coffin. Nero would speak to her as if she were still there, still his. What followed Poppea's death was nothing short of madness. Nero refused the traditional cremation. Instead, he insisted on the embalming, using spices so rare and expensive that they could have fed a starving nation. But it wasn't just her preservation that mattered. It was her presence. Nero needed Poppea's body to be placed within sight, as though she might return at any moment. Her absence a mere illusion. Servants whispered about his bizarre behavior. He would engage in full conversations with the lifeless body. At dinner, he set a place for her. In the evenings, he would look to her for counsel on matters of state. The physicians, those brave enough to try, suggested that grief often took strange forms. But Nero wasn't grieving. He was sinking deeper into his delusion. Sleep became an impossibility. Nights were spent under the weight of poppy wine, so potent that it could lull even an emperor into a dreamless, restless slumber. He awoke screaming her name, as though the very walls of the palace were withholding her from him. Nothing tasted as it should. Food, unless prepared precisely as Poppea had once preferred it, was repugnant. But the worst came when Nero began seeing her in the faces of others. A young slave girl carrying wine, Poppea. A senator's wife, her profile just so Poppea. His mind was unraveling, but it was not a slow spiral. It was a violent descent. Nero's gaze would lock on these women, his grip tightening, his eyes wild, searching for the missing piece of his soul. It happened on a mundane day, a moment that would change the course of history. A minor clerk, barely 15 years old, stepped into Nero's presence. But it wasn't the clerk's position that intrigued Nero. It was the boy's face, the exact eyes, the same amber flecks, the same tilted head. Nero had been in a state of despair for months, burying himself in administrative tasks to distract from the pain of Poppea's death. The work had long since lost its importance, and yet it was during one of these routine appointments that everything shifted. A young boy, recently promoted to a minor position, stood before the emperor. His eyes, those dark, doe-like eyes, were Poppea's eyes. Nero's world stopped. Time slowed. The boy's delicate bone structure, his tilted head, his very presence seemed to echo Poppea, her ghost walking before him. Nero approached him slowly, like a predator studying its prey. The room fell silent as the boy stood frozen, not understanding the gravity of the moment. But Nero did. "What is your name?" Nero's voice trembled, almost a whisper. The boy's response came, shaking but clear. "Sporus, divine Augustus." "I am Sporus." In that instant, Sporus was no longer an individual. He was a blank canvas, Nero's new obsession. The boy's life, his identity, was about to be erased. The emperor's delusion would consume him. The boy did not know it yet, but he was about to become someone else entirely, a perfect replica of Poppea, recreated in a twisted attempt to resurrect the dead. Days turned into weeks. Sporus was no longer a person, but a project, a canvas for Nero's delusional obsession. The boy was subjected to endless examinations, his every feature scrutinized, his every movement analyzed. His identity was now secondary to the emperor's twisted vision of resurrection. Sporus was kept in luxurious quarters, his every need catered to, yet the opulence only served to deepen the horror of his situation. The emperor's obsession was methodical, a slow and calculated process of reshaping a boy into the image of a dead woman. Nero summoned his most trusted artists, those who had painted Poppea in life, to study Sporus. Every angle of his face was measured, every curve compared, every imperfection was noted, and every flaw was to be corrected. The transformation was not just physical. Nero demanded that Sporus learn Poppea's every mannerism, her way of speaking, of walking, of holding herself. The boy's voice, once youthful and clear, was molded to mimic the delicate, lilting tones of the dead empress. He was taught to speak in her soft, drawn-out vowels, his speech now a shadow of Poppea's. Nero wasn't content with mere imitation. He wanted perfection. Sporus was no longer allowed to use his own name. He was to be called lady or mistress. His clothing was replaced with flowing stolas and Poppea's favorite colors. Her perfume dabbed on his skin. Even his very touch was molded. His hands were trained to move with the elegance of a Roman matron, to hold a wine cup delicately, to gesture with refined grace. There were moments when Sporus would look in the polished bronze mirror and barely recognize himself. His reflection no longer bore any trace of the boy he once was. His identity was slipping away, piece by piece. But what could he do? To defy Nero was to invite death. So he submitted, silently, painfully. He had become an object, a tool in the hands of an emperor who believed he could bring the dead back to life. His transformation wasn't just physical, it was an annihilation of who he was and what he had been. The day came when Nero could wait no longer. The surgeons were summoned. The instruments were prepared. Sporus's transformation was about to become complete. No longer a boy, no longer a person. He was about to become the woman Nero had imagined, a vessel for his impossible obsession. The procedure was not a simple castration. Nero wanted more. He wanted to create a woman from a man, to turn the very biology of Sporus into something that would fulfill his twisted fantasy. The physicians, trembling in fear of Nero's wrath, had been instructed to perform the unimaginable, to reshape Sporus's body to fit the vision of a woman he had lost forever. The night before the surgery, Nero came to Sporus's chambers. He carried with him a small wooden box, inside of which was a ring, Poppea's wedding ring. The emerald, surrounded by pearls, gleamed as Nero slid it onto Sporus's finger. The gesture was tender, almost loving, yet it carried with it the weight of Sporus's impending destruction. "Tomorrow you will be reborn," Nero said, his voice thick with anticipation. "You will become who you were always meant to be, and I will love you as I loved her." Sporus, his voice barely audible, asked the only question that mattered. "Will it hurt?" For a brief moment, Nero hesitated. Something akin to human empathy flickered in his eyes, but it was fleeting. "Birth always hurts," he replied. "But what emerges is beautiful." The surgery lasted for hours, the pain excruciating beyond measure. The screams of Sporus, muffled through thick stone walls, echoed through the palace, a sound that would haunt the physicians for the rest of their lives. Nero paced outside, his nerves on edge, as though he were waiting for the birth of a new life. In the weeks that followed, Sporus's recovery was agonizing. The pain was constant. The physical changes were brutal, requiring him to relearn basic functions. But Nero was there every step of the way, his presence constant, his attention unwavering. He wasn't caring for a person. He was perfecting his creation. And through it all, Sporus remained silent. What could he say? His body had been changed to fit another's delusion. His identity had been erased, replaced by someone he had never been. Sporus was no longer a boy, nor was he Poppea. He was something new, something broken. And now, the real transformation began, not in his body, but in his soul. The physical healing was a process, but the psychological transformation was far more sinister. Nero had no intention of simply dressing Sporus in woman's clothing. No, he was creating a performance, a role that Sporus would have to play for the rest of his life. Every day, Sporus was subjected to more lessons, more molding. He learned to walk in a way that Poppea would have, her smaller, more graceful steps. He was taught how to speak, how to modulate his voice, and how to laugh as she had. He studied the books Poppea had read, memorized her favorite poems, and even learned her opinions on matters of state. It wasn't enough for Sporus to look like her. He had to be her. Every moment, every word, every gesture was part of performance. Sporus was not allowed to be himself, not even in his thoughts. His identity was continually erased, replaced with the memories, opinions, and mannerisms of a woman he never truly knew. And it was never enough for Nero. If Sporus faltered, even in the smallest way, Nero would grow cold. He would pull back, as though the illusion had been shattered, as though Sporus was no longer worthy of the role he was playing. The emotional cruelty was just as devastating as the physical. Sporus was torn between his desire to survive and the intense pressure to become someone he could never be. Months passed, and Sporus became more than just a shadow of Poppea. He had been shaped, molded, and perfected. The world was about to witness the grotesque result of Nero's obsession. The first public appearance of Nero's new wife sent shockwaves to the court, the empire, and beyond. The night of the dinner party arrived, a private affair with Nero's closest advisors and their wives. Sporus, dressed in Poppea's signature purple gown, stepped into the room. At first glance, it was as though Poppea had been resurrected. The resemblance was so uncanny that it struck like a physical blow. The servants froze. The guests gasped. Nero's resurrection was complete. Sporus entered with the grace Nero had demanded. He moved through the room with all the elegance expected of an empress. His every gesture, every smile, a perfect mimicry of Poppea's life. For a moment, even the most cynical courtiers forgot the truth. They saw not Sporus, but the image of Nero's beloved wife, returned from the dead. Nero, beaming with pride, kept a possessive hand on Sporus throughout the evening. He introduced him as Sabina, Poppea's family name, and treated him as though nothing had changed. His guests, masters of survival in a brutal empire, played along. They complimented Sabina's beauty, spoke of her health, and treated her as though she were the same woman who had once walked the halls of the palace. But the illusion was fragile. There were cracks that no amount of makeup, no amount of cosmetics could hide. Tacitus, writing years later, recorded the subtle observations of those who had witnessed the charade. Sporus's hands, though smooth and painted, were still too large for a woman's. His shoulders, hidden beneath flowing fabric, betrayed his true sex. And when Sporus forgot himself, when his true voice slipped out, it was a reminder that no matter how well the performance was executed, Sporus could never truly become Poppea. And yet, the illusion continued. For Nero, it was enough. For his court, it was survival. For Sporus, it was torture. Life as Nero's empress was no longer a life at all. Sporus woke each morning surrounded by Poppea's possessions, his every movement dictated by the expectations of a dead woman. Nero's obsession had consumed him, and now it was consuming Sporus too. The palace was now a stage, and Sporus played his role every day, every hour. When he woke, he was greeted by servants who had once attended Poppea, now dressing him in her gowns, arranging her hair as it had been. Every gesture, every look, every moment of his life had been molded to recreate Poppea's life. Nero insisted on taking his new wife everywhere, whether the theater, the races, religious ceremonies, or state functions. The empire looked on, fascinated by this eerie spectacle. Sporus sat in the empress's box at the Colosseum, carried in Poppea's litter through the streets of Rome, and received the honors of an empress, though it was all a facade. The Roman people, ever hungry for spectacle, stared at this impossible sight. A boy transformed into a ghost of a dead woman. The public moments were the worst for Sporus. There, in the eyes of all, he had to be Poppea. But it was the private moments that showed the true horror of Nero's obsession. Sporus was forced to respond as Poppea would have, to reflect her every thought, every opinion, every tenderness. There were no moments of solace, no moments where Sporus could simply be himself. The weight of this constant performance crushed him, body and soul. There were attempts to escape, but they were futile. Sporus was too recognizable now. He wore Poppea's jewelry, lived in her rooms, and bore the marks of her transformation. Even when he tried to disappear into the palace gardens, he was a walking symbol of Nero's insanity. As Nero's empire crumbled, so too did the last vestiges of Sporus's humanity. The dissociative disorder that had taken root in him began to consume him entirely. He was no longer Sporus, nor Poppea. He was simply a ghost. Sporus's mind fractured under the constant strain of his existence. He began to speak in two voices, one his own, the other Poppea's. Servants reported finding him conversing with mirrors, his reflection showing a blend of two identities, one that had been stolen and one that had never truly existed. The summer of 68 AD brought with it the collapse of Nero's reign. Rebellion spread like wildfire across the empire. The Praetorian Guard had abandoned him, and the Senate had declared him an enemy of the state. As Nero fled Rome, Sporus remained by his side, still bound in by the illusion Nero had created. The last days of Nero were filled with delusions of escape, but through it all, Sporus remained, still playing the role of the emperor's beloved wife. There were no more grand dinners, no more public appearances. Nero's madness had reached its pinnacle. When the end was inevitable, Nero chose death. Yet even in his final moments, he demanded that Sporus perform. He begged Sporus to mourn him as Poppea would have, to conduct the ritual lamentations. And so, in the final act of his life, Nero forced Sporus to continue the charade. As the dagger pressed to Nero's throat, Sporus guided it. Perhaps the only moment in his life where he was not a puppet to Nero's whims. Nero was dead, but Sporus's nightmare had just begun again. His transformation had been complete, but his identity, now irrevocably erased, remained a commodity to be exploited. The brutal spectacle that awaited him under a new emperor would be the darkest chapter of his tragic existence. After Nero's death, Sporus found himself a living trophy, a symbol of the decadence and madness that had marked the emperor's reign. Galba, the first of Nero's successors, treated Sporus with cold indifference. The boy was a curiosity, a remnant of a lost regime. But Galba saw little value in him beyond his symbolic role. For a few months, Sporus lived in a strange limbo. He was dressed as a woman, still called Sabina by the courtiers, but with none of the obsessive attention Nero had lavished upon him. But Sporus's true degradation came under the rule of Vitellius. Unlike Galba, Vitellius saw Sporus as something more than a living relic. To him, Sporus was a source of entertainment, a curiosity to be displayed for the amusement of the masses. Vitellius, a gluttonous, crude man, had little regard for the dignity of those around him, and he had a grotesque idea for how to use Sporus. In a grotesque mockery of Roman spectacle, Vitellius ordered that Sporus perform in the Colosseum, not as a spectator, but as a participant in the games. The emperor announced that Sporus would reenact the myth of Proserpina, the maiden taken by Pluto to the underworld. Sporus was to be abducted by gladiators dressed as demons, subjected to public humiliation, raped, and then killed. The Roman people, ever hungry for brutal entertainment, would watch as the tragedy of stolen life was played out before their eyes. When Sporus learned of his fate, he finally found within himself the strength to resist. After years of torment, he made the only choice he had left, death on his own terms. The exact method remains unclear, but historians agree that Sporus chose to end his life, escaping the degradation that had been thrust upon him. In the grand narrative of Roman history, Sporus is little more than a footnote. He was a boy whose identity was stolen, whose body was mutilated, and whose every moment was a lie. Yet in his final act, Sporus reclaimed his humanity, not by surviving,